everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
When we look at something called the Women's Political Empowerment Index, which is looking at factors of how women are involved in their societies, whether they have access to economy and mobility in the same way, whether they're involved in politics in that country. It's called the Women's Political Empowerment Index. And just with a 1-unit increase, this study showed that there was an 11.51% decrease in carbon emissions. And that's pretty big, 11.51% from the fact that women are more engaged in society. And this goes on and on from the grassroots level. When we look at 40 to 80% of all household food production in the global south is done by women, which is completely connected to climate adaptation.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Osprey Orielle Lake, founder and executive director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network. Welcome to the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So you sit on the executive committee for the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature and on the steering committee for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Of course, in the past several years, the U.S. has produced more oil output than even Saudi Arabia. And we're also seeing a significant consolidation in the Permian Basin. For example, ExxonMobil acquiring Pioneer Natural Resources. Diamondback Energy is in the process of buying Endeavor Energy Resources. And even on the EV side, we're seeing sales slow down, and even the Biden administration backing off from aggressively transitioning to EV in the next several years. Are we as a society going backwards?
I think there's a mixed response. I think in some areas, yes, we are. And in other areas, we're moving forward. So starting just a little bit with what's going backwards, I think there has been a huge disappointment in the Biden administration for the very reasons that you stated, which is there's more fossil fuels being produced when we know that the International Energy Agency, we know that the IPCC, the United Nations, everyone is calling for a fossil fuel phase out. And so to continue to be producing more and more fossil fuels is completely the opposite direction of where we need to go right now, and is not in alignment with the Paris Climate Agreement and will not keep us to the 1.5 degree guardrail. So in that sense, I don't think we're making the progress we need to, not just in the United States, but globally. The part that is moving in the positive direction is that I think more and more people are aware about the climate crisis and environmental degradation. And so those concerns are also going to continue to pressure governments to move in the right direction, as well as financial institutions. So, there's two sides of the story here.
Right. And I just want to, put out there for our listeners is that it's kind of the lesser of the evil, where whether we like it or not, we are likely facing Biden and Trump again, whether constitutionally at the Supreme Court he's allowed or not. But there is that probability that he could come back into administration again, Trump I'm talking about, at which point that is going to be lesser or the worse, I would say, the bigger of the evil from that point of view. I want to go back to something that I think you had mentioned in some of your publications, which is, I wonder, what do you mean by it's time to rewild ourselves and our dominant worldviews to build Earth-centered communities for all?
So, my day job, so to speak, at the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network involves a lot of very practical application of climate mitigation or adaptation. We work with Indigenous, Black, and Brown women leaders around the world, doing different types of projects, and and also combining that with bringing grassroots leaders to meet with whether it's government officials or financial institutions. So we have some good cross-pollinating between different sectors of society. And we do reforestation work and forest protection work. So there's a lot of work that we do that is, the everyday work of protecting and defending our communities and the land. Within that context, to get to your question, is understanding what is behind how we got into these crises in the first place. And my book is really taking a deep dive into understanding that it's very difficult to change society or transform dangerous or harmful behaviors if we don't know where they're coming from as a society. We don't know what the root causes are. And so this is what I'm getting at when I talk about rewilding our societies and the dominant culture, which has been very destructive to the land and the whole ideology and practice of colonization and racism and patriarchy and these economic frameworks that are filled with endless material growth that can't be sustained on a finite planet. All of these systems are connected. And so I'm really getting at the question of how do we change our dominant society to be earth enhancing and just and equitable. And so this is what I mean by this moment of crises we're in, which many scholars are calling a polycrisis at a social, economic, and environmental level, that we have a moment to see this sort of crack in the system right now. And what do we want to fulfill it with? And how do we have a society that is, as I say, more equitable to all populations, but also caring for the earth? And this is what the question really is.
Now, again, you're referring to your book, The Story is in Our Bones. And I think the way you're suggesting is this notion of thinking in the Anthropocene, which includes, like you're referring to, transforming the interlocking crises of colonialism, racism, patriarchy, capitalism, ecocide, to building thriving communities for all. Now, as I think about that, that seems like a massive endeavor to tackle. And I wonder, while this sounds ideologically, tempting, how feasible is this?
So I think that we are capable of doing several things at once. So I see the need, and we certainly try to practice this at our organization, which is looking at the short term and looking at the long term. So in the immediate sense, we need to put out a lot of fires, to just put it in simple terms, and transform a lot of the systems that we're in, get off this fossil fuel economy, phase out fossil fuels immediately. We have to be very careful how we transition to EV, because we also want to be careful about the mining that will go on and some of the impacted communities that are already harmed from fossil fuels. And now we're going to be mining minerals in different communities. So how we go through this transition matters. And this brings me to the long-term part, which is, to answer your question, we're looking at changing these larger systems. We have to do both. Otherwise, we will continue these systems that are destroying the earth and are not equitable. So as an example, let's say we could wave a magical wand and end the climate crisis tomorrow. That doesn't change the fact that we have an extractive economy. We are over-consuming, and our earth is not equitable. People are not having the same experience of the different disasters that we're facing. And so this is why I think we have to have a systemic analysis and dig deep into, what are our societal values, what are our ethics, these kinds of bigger questions, while we're at the same time, doing the immediate work at hand. I think you have to do both.
So again, I'm trying to portray a bit of realism, but also a contrarian view, which is that when we think about what our society values, and you talk about the historical context or historical memory and why that's so critical to our Earth lineage, and I agree with you. But in terms of values, what if our values is based on racism? What if our values are based on colonialism? What if our values are based on genocide? And these are institutional things that are the hallmark of not just America, but a lot of the regions, and eventually essentially what imperialism and colonialism around the world have done. And that's all around extraction and consumption at the expense of other people.
So that's the conundrum we're in. I completely agree with you, but I don't think that when we peel back the onion, if you were to say that, we are going to find that the general scope of humanity is invested in colonization or racism or patriarchy or capitalism. I think these are values that have come out of a historical construct that has really perpetuated these systems of oppression. And so I think it's a matter of dismantling them and transforming them into a safe and equitable future for everyone. And so I think that this is the problem, is it's sort of looking like when you're fish in water, you can't see anything else. And so this is the belief system everyone is invested in. That doesn't mean it needs to remain that way. And so this is also why I've done a lot of research, and many other colleagues in different fields as well, which is that, you know, we look at our ancient histories, we see a lot of egalitarian societies. We know that you can have large civilizations that are egalitarian and are not destructive to the land. And I would also point to today intact indigenous peoples from around the world who are still living, you know, not every single indigenous community, but quite a few of them, very intact with the land around them. In fact, 80% of all the biodiversity left on Earth, you know, our forests, our waters, are in the lands and hands of indigenous peoples because of the way that they have a, you know, proper code of conduct with nature and their understanding of the ecosystems around them. So I think that there's a lot more to be said to humanity than the invention of capitalism and colonization and these other systems that we are facing as part of our poly crisis. I think that there are many people who also just desire and are already building different types of communities that they think are much more life enhancing. And so I think that we don't need to be set in the systems that exist, and understand that there's a lot of possibilities for human society.
So, as someone who is trained as a background in neoclassical economics, you know, over the years, and I'm in my 50s now, I've really had to change my thought process and some of the shortcomings of the systemic systems and infrastructure that we're talking about. And changing values in society is very difficult, very challenging. And of course, you know, in this current climate, geopolitical climate, where populism is not just at the doorsteps of America, but it's really across the world. And as climate change worsens, as you have, you know, resource issues, you have issues around migration. The latest thing being between Poland and Ukraine because of what I think is politicizing wheat transport and export, for example, highly problematic. And I think everybody would agree that government systems are not perfect by any means. But I think the challenge we're having from a realism is that we have bipartisanship. You have things where they will take bits and pieces of what they're talking about from your book, for instance, and put it in a very far extreme end of progressive and not really understand the merit of what you're talking about. I wonder if we can frame it differently, where we can go across to the people that need to hear it, because ultimately the concern that I have is, and this is something that I am very mindful on our podcast, is not to have an echo chamber. Our objective is not to influence the people that have already had these mindsets, but to influence those that do not have the mindsets. So what are your thoughts around framing things?
Well, I think that you know, first of all, I completely agree that we need to not be in an echo chamber. We can't afford it. These crises we're facing are massive, and we're going to need to speak to one another. And it's in some ways, these crises are forcing everyone to have conversations that are uncomfortable or challenging if we're going to collectively survive. And also to ensure that marginalized communities are not left behind in this process that we're going through, which is going to happen whether we like it or not. We are going to go through a process. Nature is going to ensure that. And I think we see that every day with the impacts of floods, droughts, and all other kinds of different crises that are going on. But I think that, you know, I think it would be good actually to maybe give an example here, because then it can be more practical perhaps and not so theoretical. One of the things that I find very interesting in two different areas of advocacy we do at WECAN, which is some when we are maybe trying to stop a fossil fuel pipeline from being constructed, or working to be at the UN climate talks and be able to present different perspectives and advocate for civil society and bring different ideas to government than they are progressing with now in terms of the climate talks. or whether that's talking to financial institutions. Perhaps, again, if we're trying to stop a harmful project, we might take some of the affected community members from that project and to go meet with the financial institutions who are investing in that project and explain to them, whether they feel like there are human rights violations or ecological violations happening, or if a species is endangered, or if Indigenous rights are being violated. These conversations have been quite fascinating because we're bringing together the groups of people who are being impacted by a project to, let's say, the people who are financing it or the people making legislation around that particular project. And I see very interesting things happening in those conversations because it's bringing a human face to where some of these projects are happening, and the harm is actually happening to people getting cancer in communities because of fossil fuel pollution and all these different harms. And, I don't think it's a process that is going along as fast as I'd like, but I do see there being forward motion in these moments of human contact around what is actually happening on the ground and the people making decisions. And so I just point out this one example where we can have opportunities to cross-pollinate, where we begin to start seeing a different value system emerging, because it's very difficult to go ahead and push the button on a fossil fuel project after you've heard from 3 different mothers of a community what's happening with their children, the cancer rates, that it's killing their community. It changes the dynamic, it changes policy. And I've seen that happen. Is it happening quick enough? No. But I'm just trying to find a point of practical application to your question, like, well, where do those ethics change, and how does that actually happen, and how do we not stay in our silos?
Yeah, these are fantastic, and I appreciate you bringing up the fact that there's tangibility, there's faces, there's real people behind these initiatives and projects, and it is very difficult. And I think one thing that all of us can get behind, regardless of our ideology or economic or geopolitical point of view, is the fact that climate action is non-discriminatory. It affects women, it affects feminists, it affects Indigenous, it affects everybody. For example, I lost shutters in the last recent windstorm, for example. And anytime there's a major storm these days, I am literally concerned about, like impact of the house. And of course, when we look at the rainforest, there's parts of the rainforest right now where it's so dry that the Indigenous people have no way of transporting or being able to travel at all or sustain themselves because there's no water in these streams or rivers. Parts of it I'm talking about. You have potential big fire that's likely to happen in Australia. There's a fire happening in Texas. So it is something that I think people are starting to recognize that, wow, there's some connection. Whereas I think previously, for decades, we knew that oil and gas operations or any large industries would have these negative externalities where it's polluting the water tables, people are getting cancer, and of course, it's usually the marginalized poor parts of our society. But they never did anything because it was a NIMBY issue. It's them, it's not affecting me. But climate action, climate change, I should say, is affecting everybody universally. You talk about the fact that it's so important to bring the voices of women and feminists. I wonder if you could talk about that as well as Indigenous people.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So when I first started getting involved in wondering what I could do to roll up my sleeves around the climate crisis, a lot of the research I did over a decade ago really led me to understand that the role that women play in having a really positive impact on climate leadership and the climate crisis. And I would say overall, because of the imbalance in society of gender inequality, it has harmed really everyone because we don't have egalitarian societies, and I think we need everyone's input. And I think it's quite interesting, not just at an ethical level, to have, there be balance, not just between women and men in government, but across the gender spectrum. I also think that it's important to understand that statistically, we have shown over and over again the role that women's leadership makes in decision-making around environmental and social issues. So just so that people have to get a handle on it a little bit is when we look at something called the Women's Political Empowerment Index, which is looking at factors of how women are involved in their societies, whether they have access to economy and mobility in the same way, whether they're involved in politics in that country. It's called the Women's Political Empowerment Index. And just with a 1 unit increase, this study showed that there was an 11.51% decrease in carbon emissions. And that's pretty big, 11.51% from the fact that women are more engaged in society. And this goes on and on from the grassroots level. When we look at 40 to 80% of all household food production in the global south is done by women, which is completely connected to climate adaptation, to the highest levels of government, and even seeing that when we look just at the COVID-19 pandemic, at the height of it, there were many stories that came out that showed that countries that were led by women did very much better with their populations navigating the height of the COVID-19 pandemic than the men leaders. And this is not about, putting men down. It's really about lifting women up and understanding that we need to engage women and get them centered because they're making better decisions around the environment and social and economic issues. So we need to engage their leadership. So that's why, I could go on, but I'll let people look at my website if they're interested. But there's so many stats around the role of women's leadership and why it's essential to, changing the trajectory on social ecological issues and also on peacemaking for that matter. So this is really important. And then to get to your question on Indigenous peoples, as I was mentioning earlier, 80% of our biodiversity left on Earth is in the hands of Indigenous peoples. And I think we have so much to learn about their traditional ecological knowledge, to understand Indigenous peoples as scientists, even though they might not have gone to Western universities, but their knowledge of the land is vast. And it's the technical knowledge, but also the worldview and understanding of our relationship in the greater web of life and what we can learn from different ideologies and worldviews about our relationship to nature and what does it mean to live in the natural world and in a way that is life enhancing, where we're giving back and being reciprocal with the land. And I think there's so much to learn from the very practical level with Indigenous peoples to their understanding of our worldview and our place in nature. So I'll just end by saying that I think it's what I like to say is women and Indigenous people are a climate solution. They are a solution. And how do we get into understanding the ideologies and solutions that they're offering?
Yeah, you bring up fantastic points, and I think all of these, there's plenty of ample empirical and research to support these claims as well. On the Indigenous front, what's interesting is that we've had different guests on the show, and many of them recognize that Indigenous people across the globe in some ways are, you could say, the stewards or the caretakers of these very fragile but very important regions and forests in particular. And there are mechanisms where you have big corporations like timber companies where they're incenting these local Indigenous people to actually compensate them to keep and to care for these ancient forests rather than cut them down for some sort of homogeneous crop, for example. So we're definitely starting to see that, and they are going to play a bigger role in terms of preserving and protecting our global society. As far as women go, I think a lot of this research also applies to even corporate America as well. There's plenty of ample research, like I said, that shows that women leaders tend to make better decisions that ultimately results in higher rate of return, bigger and a more sustained return on the capitalization of companies, for instance. And I think some of that could be the fact that there's a holistic thinking that tends to be, I don't want to use the word nurturing, but holistic is probably the best way I would think about it, thinking through all the different facets in a very complex structure. And completely digressing, but at the same time, I think it's important is part of the reason we're starting to see certain nations, let's say Japan and South Korea, for example, seeing negative population is because of exactly the issues you're talking about around women. South Korea, for example, have poured so much money into subsidies and incentives for families to have kids and to increase population growth, but women don't want to get married. nor do they want to have kids. And a lot of that is at the center of lack of equality, both at work and not just pay, but opportunities. And for them to go on maternity leave, oftentimes they're penalized and results in getting terminated from their position or just getting passed up for promotion, for example. So unless women are in the right position, whether it's government, whether it's private market or public sector, some of the things that we're talking about that has a meta impact to our society and ultimately climate, we're going to miss that. And so can you talk about some of the initiatives that you're directly involved with in terms of empowering some of these segments of society that are so critical, but they're not being represented properly?
Yeah. I think one of the things too that I would just add into the mix, and I'll maybe give some examples of some of our programs just so people can get a sense of what this looks like in action. But I would also add to your comments the need to understand that one of the ways that we're looking at a new economy, there's different components to a new economy, but one of them would be around something that many feminists have developed over time, feminist economies around what we call the care economy. And the fact that there is so much labor that has been done by women all over the world in terms of caretaking for their children, the fact that they are breastfeeding, the fact that they are caring for the elderly, often if their parents are sick or the elders in their family are sick, and just the basic everyday work at home of all the cooking and cleaning and nurturing and all of those things that women do that have, through society have really been placed into the realm of women's work. We have seen that, this labor that is given freely is something that is also that needs sort of an economic disruption, if you will, in the positive sense. And how do we have a care economy where all of that labor is respected and either paid for or understood to be part and particle of a successful society? And right now it's undervalued, underpaid, or not paid whatsoever. And there is literally, studies that have been done just showing that millions and millions and millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, most likely, when you actually take all of that labor into account. And so we're saying, part of decarbonizing the economy is also connected to this putting value on this unpaid or undervalued work. Even women working in the health sector and that care part of the care of society are underpaid compared to men. And so this is one piece of the puzzle that we can also start shifting, what our values are and what is actually getting paid for, because actually capitalism can't exist without all that unpaid labor, if you really think about it, because who's taking care of all those things that are not now accounted for? So that's just one thing I wanted to add into the conversation. And then, to give sort of a practical example that really was very exciting for me, is we have a project that's in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is actually a region that is quite violent for women because of a lot of the conflict in the region, and how it's very dangerous for women in terms of attacks on women when those kind of conflicts go on. And anyway, we are working in the Tombe region, which is an area that vast parts of the forest were destroyed through slash and burn techniques. And we're working with one of our really close coordinators, Nima Namadamu. And through that project, we have about 1,000 women who are reforesting this damaged land. And it's been really exciting. There's like no equipment there. It's a very rural area. We've been doing it for about 8 years. And over time, it's very interesting what happened. 25% of the trees are grown for human use, and 75% are going to rewild the forest. And this many years later, we've grown enough trees that the old growth forest, which is about 1.6 million acres, is being completely protected, because now we're using just the trees that we grew. And nature is now involved, because what we didn't expect is that all the trees we've planted have now brought back the rain and the moisture. So the natural forest is also reseeding itself. And I mention this because the women are stewarding this project. They're doing all of the work around the nurseries. And as a result, they've also gained a lot of social stature. because, they're bringing in income. They are reforesting the land, they're rejuvenating their communities. They're more safe because they're not wandering off the forest too far from their homes. And all of these things create, an ecological and social and cultural change in society. And that has brought, just a lot of joy to these communities and a lot of purpose and a lot of just well-being, because they have all this access to the foods and the things that they're growing and the things they need for their household. So I just present that as sort of like, you're asking about a holistic approach. This is sort of like how to approach some of these problems, bring healing to the earth and bring healing to the women and their communities, all in one package.
That is a fantastic story, use case, and I absolutely love it. And I'm thinking about the example of microlending and how microlending has been so effective in many of these impoverished regions across the world, but it's been really spearheaded by women. And to your point, it's fueling entrepreneurship and it's increasing their stature in their society, their tribal, villages. And I think it's important for them to have more voices. And ultimately, they're the guardians, like I said, of Earth. So you bring up a fantastic, it's probably for another conversation around, how do we properly compensate for the things that do not have a market? But, we look at it in terms of opportunity cost, but it's more than that, I think, in terms of all the labor that women are putting in that do not get necessarily captured in economic value, but in fact, there is significant economic value. So with that, I have been joined by Osprey Orielle Lake, Executive Director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.